Let me ask my colleague Rachel Thrasher to just come and say maybe a few things about why we are doing this topic, why we are doing it at this point, and why we think it's an important thing to do. Rachel?
I also want to welcome you all to the conference, and thank you so much for coming. Thank you to all of the authors who have agreed to participate, and to all of you who are here to engage in the conversation. We're excited about discussing the concept of South-South economic cooperation today, in part because we're in a changing world, and the developing world, as we're calling the global South, has really emerged in a way to cooperate together to promote economic development. Economic cooperation in the developing world comes in many forms. It comes in the form of trade agreements and targeted trade flows, foreign direct investment, currency unions, common markets, regional development makes, and many other coordinated policies between countries. Often these are aimed specifically at development because these countries have the same goals in mind. These South-South arrangements differ very significantly from North-South, similar North-South arrangements, and because the developing countries have similarities that make economic cooperation better for long-run development. So in the past, the global North, as we're calling the developed world today, maintained a position of driver of world affairs, of world economic affairs. A few principal players led negotiations in the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade. The IMF and the World Bank, led primarily by the developed world, has created ground rules for countries recovering from economic crises and for establishing new economic policies. Even economic aid directly from the developed world has come with conditions attached. And the newer mantras, trade not aid, for example, still has that idea that it is with trade with the global North that will bring development to the global South. But recent events and global trends have begun to change how people view the developing world. Globalization, although it's been blamed for many of the challenges that the South faces, has brought advances in trade and travel and communications, increased access to foreign products and services, and access to different cultures and different experiences. Even knowledge has become more widely available as through access to the internet and other media resources. Likewise, there's a shifting global demography. Populations in the global South are growing rapidly, whereas populations in the global North are stabilizing. And as the developing world begins to consume more and more of the world's resources, they will have an increased impact on global trade, just by nature of the fact that they will consume more. International institutions have played a part in shifting this balance. When the World Trade Organization came into being, there were a few developing countries that began to influence international rulemaking, and that influence has grown since the Uruguay round and since the creation of the World Trade Organization. Even the perceived failure of this current round has led to an increased influence by developing countries as they have bound together in regional trade arrangements. So overall, you see a huge growth in developing country goods trade and investment flows. You'll hear this in many of the panels today, and as a result of all of these trends, we see an increased influence. And today, I mean, as we're all recovering from this economic crisis, the developing world has shown interesting resilience and potential for leadership as we have. In recovering from the economic crisis. So while the credit crisis has had an undoubtedly negative effect worldwide, many developing countries have recovered more quickly, are pulling away from the slow growth still in the developed world. So it seems we've entered a new era. It seems in which developing countries have more incentives and more resources to work together toward global economic development. And hopefully today, through a multidisciplinary look at South-South economic cooperation, we can explore the future of what the global economy might look like.
Thanks, Rachel. Thank you very much. Thank you. I'm going to move into my role as the chair of the first session in just a minute, but I wanted to highlight, if you look at the title of the conference, those of you who know my past work, I've worked a lot on North-South. And people have been writing about South-South, but it meant it was really a periphery issue. That there's a little cooperation, and the UN would constantly try to get some South-South going very valiantly. But the discussion was really focused on North-South, and has been, and maybe still is. It seems to me that there is a shift happening. There is something important happening in that first word, the future, in terms of what's happening to South-South. And we want to take not just the South-South element of that, and that's relationships among developing countries. And there are, of course, different types of developing countries. So we want to take that seriously. But we also want to take, we wanted to take the notion, when Rachel and I sort of conceived of this, of economic relations seriously. And this really started off as a conversation between Rachel and myself on doing something about trade. And then very quickly coming to the realization that we wanted it to be more than just about trade. Because the nature of economic relationships is also more nuanced. And one of the things we are hoping here is that relationship will come. There are two conversations I want to highlight, which at least in my mind has underscored the importance of what we are doing here. The first one was in April this year. In April this year, we had a rather large conference, part of our flagship program called Africa 2060. So in April, for a whole day, we had about 150 people in the room, most of them from Africa, or many of them from Africa. We had about 20 speakers, most of them from Africa. And all day we spent talking about the future of all of Africa. So it wasn't on a particular region. We looked at the whole of Africa. And as the end of the day approached and I was making my concluding remarks, I suddenly realized something. Guess which country? So a conference is held in the US on all of Africa. Guess which country was talked about the most during that day? So the conference is on Africa. It's held in Boston, USA. Most of the speakers are African, from Africa itself. People are talking about all over Africa. Which country do you imagine? Anyone wants to make a guess? China. The country that was talked most often in that conference was China. Guess which country was nearly not talked about at all? The US. Right? I don't know what to make of that, but it struck me, sitting there, that something was happening here. I was recently in Brazil, and I was there with my kids, and kids are picky eaters, and my kids like Chinese food. And so we searched for a Chinese, if you go to Brazil, there's such rich Brazilian food already. And I went to this Chinese restaurant, and it was full of people from China, and I actually went and talked to one of them because I was just intrigued. And these were people who were economic workers from China who had come to Brazil, and we'll hear a lot about this. So part of it is this changing shift in economic relations in very many different ways, from investment to trade. And the other is a conversation that I had last night with Nader Habibi and Mehdi and others about the Middle East. And we were saying, the Middle East doesn't have as much trade. And I think Nader mentioned, or someone mentioned to me, that if we really think about economic relations, and if we include in economic relations not just trade and direct investment, but also labor movements, which is clearly an economic relations, then a part of the world that you do not usually associate with great trade flows amongst South-South becomes a major hub of South-South economic activity, i.e. the movements of very large numbers of economic workers, and therefore very deep impacts both on the host societies within the Middle East, especially in the Gulf, but also in the exporting societies, if you will, in the Philippines, in South Asia, in Africa, and so on and so forth. I mentioned those two things simply to highlight that I hope that we will have a broader sense, not just of what South-South means here, but also what economic relations mean here. And that is what we are hoping from this conference as well as from the book. Having taken maybe too much time in setting it up, but I wanted to do that because we want to set it up in the context of the final book project. Let me just very quickly get to our first panel. We have three wonderful speakers, and we'll go down the order that is in the program. I am not going to introduce them at length. You all have a copy of all of their bios, and they are all extremely talented and productive people who have done a lot of work in this area. So let me just begin immediately by asking our colleague from the University of Waterloo, Catherine Hostetler. I'm sorry, I'm going to mess up names, but my apologies for that. Catherine is coming from the University of Waterloo, and she's going to be talking about the South-South dimensions of trade and environment. Catherine, all yours.
Okay. Thank you very much for inviting me to be part of this process, and I'm really glad to be here, not least because I think I'm talking about a subject that not only have I never been asked to talk about before, but so far as I could find when I went to write about it, no one else has written about before. And this is the question that says, as economic relations move from being dominated by a north-south axis to being increasingly, as Adil was telling us, dominated by a south-south axis, what happens to things like environmental protection? Does it improve? Does it get worse? And as I say, so far as I can tell, nobody has even asked that question. And so my paper for this book really represents something of an initial effort to take up that question and to try to look at it in a fair amount of seriousness and to say, well, what happens? And the way that I've structured the paper is to begin with a general overview of some of the trade, and I'm focusing in on trade just to make the topic a little bit more manageable, but I'm focusing in on trade and saying, well, in general terms then, what do people expect of the relationship between trade and environment, and how might that be different in a South-South perspective rather than a North-South perspective? And then I'm using Brazil and a series of its trade relationships to talk with some more specificity about how those changing trade relationships are affecting environmental protection in Brazil. And the point that you should take away from this first slide, and it's a point that I think I'll be making at multiple points today, is that the South is not all one place, that in fact there are many Souths, and trying to think systematically about some of the different Souths is, I think, pretty important. Clearly, China is a different South than Brazil's South American neighbors, but I think we need to think beyond that as well to try to understand different kinds of conceptions of the South and how that might shape our expectations. But the general model of the relationship between trade and environmental degradation basically talks about these three things. And this is a model that comes out of the work of the economists Grossman and Kruger, writing about NAFTA, but it's since been used to talk about trade and environment relations fairly broadly. And they argue that you can understand the relationship between trade and environmental degradation by looking at these three components. There's the scale component, which basically says trade makes you produce more, and in that process, you use up more environmental inputs. There's energy into the production process. There's energy involved in the transport. And so there's a variety of, there's an increase in environmental degradation that simply comes from increasing the scale of trade and economic activity. Then there's the composition argument. And the composition argument says that trade can also affect environmental degradation in changing the composition of a given country's economic production. So trade presumably makes countries trade more in the areas of their comparative advantage, and then that will have an impact on what they're producing and therefore some impact on environmental degradation. And in their article, they talk about an argument that actually hasn't proved to hold up terribly well in the empirical literature, but a pollution haven argument that argues that trade means that production goes to countries with lower levels of environmental protection. And so they generally argue that the composition effect on trade, between trade and environmental degradation, again means trade will increase environmental degradation. For the technique argument, I need to show you another slide, another part of their argument that will factor into some of this discussion about different Souths. And I see Kevin Gallagher sitting in the room, and he can tell you much more about this environmental Kuznets curve. It also is not very well supported in the empirical literature, but I think there's something about it that tells us some important things about the shift from north-south to south-south trade. And this is basically an argument that they pose that suggests that levels of environmental degradation, and especially in measured in sort of degradation per unit of production, tends to be low at very low levels of per capita income. They're on the left-hand end of the picture. And then as per capita income grows, environmental degradation increases. This is the industrialization process, basically. And then there's some kind of turning point or inflection after which countries begin to use cleaner modes of production, and so then eventually come to having lower environmental degradation per unit of income. And as I say, this has had only spotty empirical evidence, but it has its best support in a time frame snapshot. So generally speaking, it is in fact true that when you look at the wealthiest countries of the world in per capita income, that they also tend to have some of the lowest pollution intensity, that they have had a whole series of environmental laws and regulations and a whole series of more modern production techniques that mean that they have somewhat lower environmental degradation per unit of production. And they're certainly more preoccupied with the environment. And it's generally true that you have a set of these sort of middle-range economic powers that have quite dirty production. The Chinas, the Brazils, the Indians of the world. And then there's another set of countries that are still largely agrarian and so have lower levels of environmental degradation. But the reason that this is a really critical slide for talking about the move from north-south to south-south trade goes as follows. When you're talking about north-south trade, much of what you're talking about is that right-hand side of this curve. So you're talking about countries with comparatively high levels of environmental protections trading with countries that have comparatively less environmental protection and are in fact then those dirty polluters, if you will, at least in this literature. And so the composition effect, which is what we're talking about, but the composition effect generally feeds off of that movement. So generally, what it's talking about is that countries there at the far right-hand side of the graph are trying to improve through their trade the production and environmental impacts of production of the countries at the top part of the curve. So the U.S. is creating trade agreements with Mexico and trying to insist that there be greater environmental protection in Mexico as a result of those trade agreements. Or they're trying to write environmental clauses into trade agreements more generally. Sometimes there are arguments that trade can improve environmental protection through consumers. So perhaps you have consumers who demand organics in those northern countries or insist on not importing soybeans from Brazil if they're grown on deforested parts of the Amazon or things like that. So there's a whole variety of mechanisms that come in north-south trade that are thought to change the technique of production in the countries with which they trade. But then what happens in south-south trade is you're dealing with a different part of the curve. Because similarly, you have the wealthiest and most powerful countries of the South in many ways driving the trade relationships. But they're the countries at the top of the curve. And they're trading with countries at the bottom of the curve. So you have countries like Brazil, China, India, South Africa trading with the Namibias, the Ecuadors, I could go on, but you see the difference. And it relates then to one of the most significant differences with the South-South versus North-South trade and environment relationship. Briefly, I see the scale effect as being largely the same. I don't see any reason why growth would have a different impact in South-South trade than it does in North-South trade. It's a basic quantitative effect. Composition, this is the part that's more complicated because composition effectively comes down to very national differences in comparative advantage. And they're clearly different because patterns of comparative advantage are very different when you're talking about comparative advantages among only the southern countries as opposed to comparative advantages among all the countries of the world. I'm least sure probably on how to talk about the composition component of South-South trade. I'm guessing that it's generally neutral or hard to define. But the place where I think that our existing theory about trade environment relationships probably changes the most between North-South trade and South-South trade is on the technique effect. Because that set of middle-range powers that is going to be driving South-South trade isn't, as far as I can tell, and maybe I haven't thought about it quite in the time frame as long as you have, but I would say in a 10 to 20 year time frame, certainly, I don't expect China to be insisting that its trading partners have good environmental production processes. Certainly, it's not insisting on that right now. I don't even expect Brazil to, because interestingly, Brazil, even though it has the best environmental protections inside Mercosur, has been adamant about not bringing environment into trade agreements. So there's a variety of ways. I don't think the consumers in these countries provide the same kind of motivation for a change in technique. And so in some ways, I would say it works the opposite. And you'll see in some of my case studies that I think there's some evidence for this, that some of these arguments that having trade relationships improves the environmental techniques begin to have the opposite effect. And the technique effects might actually be negative. So that if the countries of these big emerging powers, if the big emerging powers are moving techniques of production to less well-developed developing countries of the South, they're probably giving them more degrading technologies. So Adil tells me I have only 5 minutes, so let me go to some of the evidence to show you how I see the Brazilian case as supporting some of these initial discussions that are thoughts that I had about what the relationship might be. I won't spend a lot of time on this, but I, in the paper, talk a bit about emerging powers, and I'm basically talking about the BRICS minus Russia and the next 11, that set of countries that Goldman Sachs talks about, and I compare them to the OECD countries. Their incomes are lower, and their environmental protection and bureaucratic abilities are generally lower as well. So that's all that says. So let me go on to China then. This is the first one of the trading relationships that Brazil has, and this is I call trading up, because this is the idea, or what I'm talking about in the paper, is that the U.S. used to be Brazil's largest trading partner in the last couple of years. That's become China. And what impact does that have on Brazilian production, and how might that affect the environment? And I'm just going to focus on the particular piece of the relationship that I think has the most relationship to the environment. With China, the biggest effect is a composition effect. And it has to do with these numbers that I show you here. These are Brazil's trade numbers between 2000 and 2010. You see that in 2000, about 23% of their trade was in primary products. It is now almost 44%, so it's almost doubled. And trade in industrial goods has come down. This is almost entirely due to the China effect, because in Brazil's trading relationships broadly, 60% of its exports are manufactured exports. Only 30% of its, I'm sorry, and it's, I have to look at my numbers. 30% of all of Brazil's exports are primary products. 60% of its exports to China are primary products. And in particular, China wants a set of Brazil's products where you can see direct environmental degradation. It wants wood pulp, it wants timber, equals deforestation. It wants soybeans, which in the Brazilian context, increasingly soybean production is the largest source of deforestation. So you can trace a number of extremely direct relationships between the products Brazil wants from China and that they are among the most environmentally degrading of products that Brazil produces. So there's a very clear effect here in the shift from the U.S. to China and the kinds of composition of the products that they want. That means that Brazil produces more of these things to export to China, and its overall degradation profile worsens. There's also a technique effect, and I talk more about this in the paper, but in the mid-2000s, Brazil and I think it was the UK actually set up this and then the EU set up this agreement that Brazil would not send to them any soybeans that had been planted on deforested lands. So they got only Brazil's soybeans grown on non-deforested lands. China took all the rest. Quite striking. Similarly, when Brazil was still not producing genetically modified soybeans, all of its non-GM soybeans went to Europe, and China took all of the rest of the world's GM soybeans. And so not only is China not insisting on compositional effects with its trading partners, but its choices are in many ways undermining Europe's ability to use market mechanisms to protect the environment. Because China will always take those products even if their techniques are not environmentally sound. So skipping on then a bit, another relationship I talk about is South America, where Brazil is the China, if you will. Brazil is the large exporter of manufactured products and the importer of its neighbors' raw materials and energy. And I'm just going to highlight what happens, or the most significant environmental impact of Brazil's South America-based relations. And they go like this. Almost all of South America's population, about 80% of it, lives within 100 kilometers of the coast. And this is a continent that's 5,000 kilometers wide. Almost all of South America's trading patterns have been to take products to the coast and get them out. So when South America decided at the beginning of the 2000s that it wanted to do much more trade inside South America, the first thing that it had to do was actually something that the Grossman and Kruger model doesn't talk about much at all. They had to build the infrastructure of trade. And building the infrastructure of trade in South America means building roads, building highways, building a whole series of infrastructure for transport and production straight through the middle of a continent. And the middle of this continent goes by names like the Amazon rainforest, the Pantanal wetlands. And so the clearest environmental impact of Brazil's South American trade actually isn't from any of the scale, composition, or technique effects, but it has to do with the fact that they have to build the infrastructure to do it. And that infrastructure has very direct and negative environmental implications. Trade's going up. This is Brazil with the the Andean community. It's the blue line, so it's obviously actually doing very well with its neighbors. And here's Brazil with Mercosur. Again, you can see in the 2000s these go up. There's a scale effect there as well. But as I say, I think the most important implication there is with the infrastructure of trade rather than trade per se. Final relationship is what I call Brazil trading across. And this is Brazil in IBSA, India, Brazil, and South Africa. And as I point out in the paper, and as you can see from this graph, the top line there, that's Brazil's trade with Argentina. You can see it's going way up. The bottom lines, the blue and the red ones, those are Brazil's trade with India and South Africa. And this tells you almost everything you need to know about IBSA, which is that it's aspirational. It has almost no impact on actual trade. So in terms, again, of the Kruger and Grossman model, almost none of it applies because there's hardly any trade going on. Brazil's trade with neither of these countries ever is above 1.5% of either country's total trade. Here's how this relationship affects trade. And again, I can do this only very briefly, but can talk about it more later. The main way that this grouping of South-South countries affects trade is in its impact on things like trade rules. This is a set of countries that had an awful lot to do with shutting down the Doha round. On agricultural grounds primarily, India taking a strong lead in this, Brazil and South Africa backing up, and part of it because of these agreements with IBSA. Similarly, these three countries with China were very important in the final stages of the Copenhagen Climate Change Conference, and depending on who you read about that, either destroyed it or made it move forward. And I don't have time to go into that in great detail, and some of it we're still waiting to see what happens. But I would argue that this set of countries the impact of this set of countries on the relationship between trade and environment, it goes much more through their ability to influence international rules than it actually goes through any of the concrete economic trade relationships. So just to summarize, when you're the first person, it's really bad to go on really way too long. as South-South trade gains greater weight, I think I see a mixed picture for the environment. And some of that mixed picture for the environment comes about from the importance of that set of middle-range powers. It's not that they don't have any commitment to environmental protection, but they have an ambiguous commitment to environmental protection. And to the extent that they're now the countries driving the trade relationship, the South-South trade relationship, I think that the relationship between trade and environment is probably going to worsen somewhat, but in any case will become much more complicated. And I think, though, that not all of these middle-range powers are the same with respect to environmental protection, and that some of our understanding of their impact on the relationship between trade and environment is going to require understanding better some of the differences between Brazilian environmental protections and Chinese environmental protections and South African ones, especially because of the weight that each of those plays in their respective regions.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you, Catherine, for that very interesting, somewhat provocative, but we'll come to that later. Very interesting set of ideas on the impact on the environment of potential growth in South-South trade. I think moving right along and very much in line with that, our next speaker will talk about South-South foreign direct investment and whether that is wishful thinking or a reality. So let me ask Mariana Rangel Padilla to take the... And thank you, Catherine, also for staying on time. We will therefore leave more time for discussions. Thank you.
Good morning. Well, as Adil said, I will be presenting on South-South foreign direct investment. Is it wishful thinking or a reality? But first, I want to thank Adil, Rachel, and Elaine for the invitation and also for all the help in making this come a reality. I come from Mexico, and part of my interest in South-South relationships stems directly from reality because I work at Tecnológico de Monterrey in Monterrey, and you should know that Monterrey is a business center, and many of the companies that Mexico has, multinational companies that Mexico has, are based there. And as I grew up, I realized that some of them actually go to the north countries, but many others are right now are increasingly focused in south destinations. So you have companies like Cemex going to Colombia, to exploring opportunities in Brazil, exploring opportunities in India, or as far as Angola, for example, or Nigeria. And then you also have, and more recently in the last 10 years, I've also seen a change in the country of origin from multinational companies settled in Mexico. As you also should know, Mexico saw a large inflow of foreign direct investment during the last 20 years, mostly related to NAFTA and all the regional integration that has been promoted. And in the last 10 years, besides getting a lot of European and Japanese investment, we've also received Indian companies, for example, in the IT sector, or Korean car manufacturing companies, or Argentinian steel companies. So, as I was telling you, well, this presentation is inspired in that reality. Okay. It's just here, right? Yeah. Okay. Well, the presentation is divided in 4 sections, and the first one sets up the general context of South-South FDI inflows. It's good to be some of the first to present because I will have a chance of exploring this issue. Then I will focus in two specific case studies, India and Brazil, because, well, it's largely related to the fact that India and Brazil are among the top 25 investors in the world. And Brazil holds the 21st place, and well, India holds the 31st place, okay? But among the South investors, South origin investors, Brazil holds the 4th place and India the 7th place. And they are also part of the BRIC, as Catherine said, and well, then we will move into conclusions. Okay. So the general context, when we think in a longer range term, it is important to consider that South-South foreign direct investment flows are not new, although they have increased in the amount. In the past, we've already seen some cooperation, particularly related to the emergence of the G77 and the idea of the new economic international order in the 60s, which had as an objective to promote South-South cooperation for development. And since then, we've had this phenomenon. Although the G77 has a decreased importance in the general context of international institutions, by 2010 it has 132 members, but it has lost relevance because of the emergence of other forums and also because some of its founding members that were important to the movement had left or quitted because they wanted to become part of the OECD. More recently, we've had other forums like the IPSA that was just mentioned in the previous presentation. And one of the objectives of IPSA is to promote trade and investment opportunities between the 3 regions of which they are part. And IPSA is made out of India, Brazil, and South Africa. So we would expect the investment flows to be larger or at least motivated by this objective. And there's another change in the United Nations Development Program special unit that devoted to trade and cooperation between developing countries, and they focused or they shift their focus into South-South cooperation. And their argument is that this kind of cooperation can make Millennium Development Goals more attainable. So in general, there's an expectation that increased investment between South and South countries, South-South countries, will increase development. Okay, that's to begin with. Some of the research questions that drove this paper is related to the trends that, or wants to explore the trends that have emerged in South-South investment and whether they will persist in future decades. When I was asked to do this, I was a little bit, hesitant because I thought, well, how can you predict something, right? It's very difficult, and particularly because globalization has brought up so many changes that make it difficult. But I think that if we look at, as Adil was saying, in a longer range framework, we can learn many things from the past and try to see whether those particularities are going to continue or whether we can expect some changes. Some sub-questions that are related is which are the main characteristics of these flows, of South-South flows? Are there any particular industries in which cooperation is more intense? And to what extent are South-South exchanges contributing to development? Considering the history of South-South cooperation and data on destinations of South outward foreign direct investment flows, in the first wave of investment that took place in the 1970s, early 1980s, it is expected that as countries in developing world liberalized their economies in the 1990s, previous investment patterns continued or even increased. Okay. And this chart shows a little bit the contribution of developing countries into total foreign direct investment. You can see that by 1980 they held around 13%. Then by 1990 their share contracted, and it was largely due to the fact that many of the developing countries went into a series of economic and financial crises that led many companies to retrench or withdraw their investments abroad. Then after a series of economic liberalization and stabilization programs, their share increased up to 14%. And by 2008, the share they have, it's around 15%. Okay. This is a chart that shows the evolution in the long-range evolution of the main investors. And you can see, well, Singapore is the most important investor from the South. And well, there's also some hesitation from my part to include Singapore as a South country because of its development levels. But, and then you will have Brazil that ever since the 1980s had an important amount of foreign direct investment abroad. This is in the whole world, not only in South-South. So you can see that Brazil has sharply increased its flows since the year 2000. And then you would also see Indian flows. It's the one with the triangle. And you can also see how, particularly after 2004, Indian investment has increased. Other important countries of origin are Korea, China, which I didn't explore because there's a special section in the book that we're preparing that will deal and explore China. And we also have Korea, Malaysia, Mexico, South Africa. Okay. Now let's move into the India case study. I divided the case studies into two sections, well, because I found that both countries had an early first wave of foreign direct investment towards the South, as I was telling you, in the context of this new economic international order debate in the 1960s until 1980s. And it was, to a certain degree, driven by government policy. Both countries, or in the case of India, I will focus in India, it had an import substitution industrialization model, so they restricted their investment. And every proposal was placed before an interministerial committee. There were some incentives to companies that saw FDI as a vehicle for export promotion. So they were granted with fiscal benefits, cash compensatory support for exports, etc. The outcomes were that by 1983, I must also point out that Indian investment was also driven by cultural and ethnic ties. Because of the Indian diaspora being such an important factor, many companies decided to settle in Asia and in African countries. And by 1983, there were around 140 foreign investment projects, and most of it went to South countries, around 93% of the total. Manufacturing sector was the most important one, comprising 80% of the flows. And it was largely greenfield investment. When we have a look at the current or more recent flows of Indian investment, you can notice that the structural adjustment led to a liberalization of investment, and they provided with automatic routes. They removed all the investment requirements, ceilings, etc. To a certain degree, there has been a government support through funding sometimes and through information, but it has not been very much. The outcomes, in general, the approved projects have increased, and the stocks of foreign direct investment have also increased. However, South countries' share has decreased, and in the past, in 1995, they only received 47% of the total flows, and by 2006, they only received 32%. Most of it goes into manufacturing, or 43%, and also something that it's important or interesting about India is that it devotes a large share to non-financial services, like IT services. And another way at looking at this issue, not only in terms of flows, it's also in terms of mergers and acquisitions. And in this column, well, this table sums the information, but I want you to focus in the blue column where you can see how most of the mergers and acquisitions that Indian companies have made, have been in the north, and only 12% or 13% have been in the south. It's mostly in the north. It's been mostly in the mining and metal products, acquisitions of large steel companies in Canada and in the UK. And then in the south, it's been a very large investment in oil in Sudan. Okay? But if we take a closer look at other sectors and we don't just start at look at the general context, we can also find that there's some investment in pharmaceutical and IT that looks promising. And in terms of the South investments of pharmaceutical companies, they comprise around 20%, and also IT companies have been making investments in the South. Around 18% of their total affiliates or locations are based in the South. Now, when we look at the Brazilian case study, we can see that, similarly to that of India, it was largely inspired or propelled in the first era. It was largely propelled by government, and it was mostly the same reason. Import substitution industrialization model was implemented, and they saw FDI as a way of promoting exports. And also, well, the advantage that Brazil had was that it had a strong domestic market that served as a springboard. In terms of the outcomes, most of the FDI was undertaken by state-owned enterprises in that time, and they were their destinations were more varied. Around 20% of their outward flows went into the South countries and mostly in Latin America. With regards to the second wave, we have that there has been an economic liberalization process in Brazil, and that included, or despite that fact, the Brazilian government protected domestic champions, and that led to a series of investments by these domestic champions abroad. In 2003, there was a declaration by the Ministry of Finance and Trade that they should have at least 10 transnational companies by 2010. And also in the case of Brazil and also in the case of India, we've seen that they have been signing many bilateral investment treaties and double taxation treaties, and that somehow gives a general framework for them. In terms of the outcomes, we see that most of Brazilian outflows now are going into North countries and also into overseas financial investment centers. So the South now has only 8% from the 20% that it used to have. And Brazilian companies prefer greenfield investment rather, although many analysts say that more companies are using M&As, mergers and acquisitions, increasingly. In terms of their largest greenfields projects, we can see in a span of 2002 to 2004 that around 67% of their greenfield projects went to the South, and this gives us a different picture, mostly in energy and tourism, metals and food sectors, and most of them in Latin America. And in terms of the mergers and acquisitions, we can also see that mining has an important share, particularly in investment flows towards the north, and metal products and oil also has an important share in terms of investment towards the south. You can also see in the last column how most of the mergers and acquisitions are in the north. Okay. So very quickly, after looking at different measures of South-South economic, South-South foreign investment flows, we can see that in the first wave, it was largely driven by the need to avoid tariffs and quotas and export-oriented policies. There was an emergence of national champions, particularly in Brazil, and there was an important there was importance of cultural and regional ties for both countries. They had a clear government support in that time. In the second wave of South-South foreign direct investment flows, there's growth in absolute terms, but not in the shares that South-South investment flows have. Despite IPSA's objectives, most of the outward investment from Brazil and India goes to North countries. Brazilian companies invest in natural resources and manufacturing sectors, and interestingly, Indian companies invest in manufacturing, non-financial, and R&D intensive sectors. There's some natural resource investment, as we saw in oil fields in Sudan, but I do want to highlight the importance or the promise of this type of investment. In general, government support to FDI flows in the past helped directly or indirectly the destinations chosen by business, and even if we want more South-South investment flows, if that's a real commitment from the governments and from international institutions, there should be a more decisive effort, because as we have it right now, well, business are mostly driven by market incentives rather than this political willingness to help to development. So as we've seen, the natural trend has, in the recent period, has been mostly focusing in acquiring technology from companies from the north rather than helping to development in the south. So if we would want to see more South-South FDI, there should be a more intensive cooperation in terms of support from governments and from international institutions.
Thank you. Thank you very much, thank you very much. Another extremely interesting and very pertinent set of, there are obviously, I'm sure, lots of questions. I certainly have many, and I'm sure you do. We'll take the questions at the end of the three presentations, if that is okay. Our third presenter is with us from Brazil, from the University of Brasilia, Alcides Costa Vaz, and he'll be talking about, exactly following on this, the role of emerging economies.
Do you have a PowerPoint?
No. Thank you. Well, good morning. First of all, I want to thank you very much, the Pardee Center, for the opportunity to join the project, to share research and knowledge on such an interesting and defined topic. Well, my contribution to the project has to do with the examination of the role of emerging economies in promoting South-South trade and some of its political dimensions and its political reach in terms of global governance, on forging global governance mechanisms. And in order to do so, we've been requested to examine topics related to South-South economic relations that can illustrate the political challenges faced by emerging countries in promoting it. So my text focuses on three main issues, and at this point I'm doing it mostly from a Brazilian perspective, even though this is not intended to be only a case study. From previous presentation, I can already see that we have been converging on some of the diagnostics regarding trade and investment patterns of being promoted by Brazil, India in particular. But at this point, my findings are highly concentrated on the Brazilian perspective. So it focuses on three issues: trade developments, investments, and the promotion of new mechanisms of global economic governance. And the idea is to identify the incentives and the constraints that Brazil has come across in its political endeavor to promote and strengthening South-South relations. So initially, it presents an overview of recent developments regarding South-South trade and its importance for Brazilian foreign policy and for Brazilian foreign trade. And this has allowed me to exemplify and discuss some issues that I regard of relevance not only for Brazil, but also for India and for South Africa in particular. I did not address China because China's cases regarding trade and investment have been the object of other chapters and other researchers in the project. So I think the Brazilian case exemplifies and discusses how emerging countries have achieved a positive foreign trade performance without necessarily changing its relative position in world trade significantly. An issue of crucial importance, in my view, to assess the functionality of South-South trade as an inducer of changes, of transformations in the world economic order. And this is a political aspiration that Brazil has nurtured, that India has nurtured, that South Africa has nurtured as well. It also allows us to analyze the growing importance of South-South trade globally and for each of these countries. But it also shows that this growth is an uneven one, not only in terms of market concentration or sectoral concentration. It's also uneven in the sense that, in the case of Brazil, its South-South trade has become more important for its exports than from its imports. It exemplifies how beneficial South-South trade has been to help Brazil overcome the negative impact of current world economic crisis. But at the same time, it shows a pattern of concentration of commercial links on a very few actors in the global South. And they are the other big emerging economies, namely China, India, and South Africa. We have just heard that there are different Souths, and this is true. But we cannot disregard the less developed economies of the South as part of this picture. And what we can identify when we go deeper into the Brazilian case, and somehow this is also reflected in the trade statistics of India, of South Africa as well, is that there is a core, a very small core group of countries, and we can easily identify them. They have been permanently named here: China, India, Brazil, and South Africa at a longer distance from these three big emerging countries. So this leads us to question, what's the political background behind this South-South trade dynamics going on at the present? And what I can see is that South-South trade as a priority, as a political priority for Brazil, especially from 2003 to the present, has allowed Brazil to move away from the emphasis on trade liberalization, on the approach on that presided over trade negotiations in the 90s, mostly oriented to free trade arrangements. And it also allows Brazil to seek for a more balanced distribution of trade flows. Brazil exhibited a very concentrated pattern of trade distribution in its export markets. That is, 50% of our total exports for several decades were concentrated in the Western Hemisphere. That means the United States and Latin America. And this has been regarded as a source of vulnerability for the country. Even though individually the European Union was our major trading partner, that would just add to that concern, because that would mean that 75 to 80% of Brazilian foreign trade of Brazilian export markets were the United States, the European Union, and a minor share with Latin America. So the emphasis on South-South trade in the present decade has allowed Brazil to try and effectively get to change this picture. Last week, Brazil's government was celebrating the fact that for the first time, most of its exports, some 54% of its exports, were targeted at the developing countries' markets. With the United States scaling down in our hierarchy of export destinations to the fourth position, following China, Latin America, then the European Union, and then the United States. But the fact that for the first time, the greatest share of our exports are being directed to developing nations' markets exemplifies the importance of South-South trade in achieving not only economic but also political objectives, because that means reducing not only the vulnerability but the reliance on the developed markets, economies, markets. It has also played an important role in the articulation of regional trade markets. In my chapter, I do not develop the regional argument because we have been oriented not to focus strictly on a specific region in the project, but it's important to highlight that by politically insisting on South-South trade development, Brazil has also found common grounds within its neighbors to articulate a regional trade space from Mercosur, from free trade agreements and free trade arrangements with neighboring countries that have been associated to Mercosur. At the present, Mercosur has 4 full members, and Bolivia, Chile, Peru, Colombia, and Venezuela as associated members. So that comprises 10 countries that are moving slowly towards trade liberalization within South America itself. And finally, it's been important in the political endeavor to exercise influence in trade negotiations and decision-making process and in forging global economic governance mechanisms at the global level. An interesting point regards investments, what we have just heard from Ariana's presentation. And basically, the picture that I have gotten from the analysis of foreign investment flows is the same and points to the same concerns and issues that have been raised in Mariana's presentation. What I see here is that the growing importance of emerging countries in foreign direct investment is not reflected in the pattern of foreign direct investment promotion among them. And we've seen that numbers are decreasing, that the figures are decreasing. As to Brazil, even though our whole stock of foreign investment capital is almost reaching $200 billion, less than 10% of it has been directed to developing economies. So this marks, in my view, 2 key aspects. One, investments have not played the same role that trade has in spawning South-South relations. And second, it points to a disconnection between trade and investment dynamics when we consider the South-South economic relations. So I think this is a very interesting point of research, of inquiry, to to investigate the sources and the implications of this disconnection for South-South economic relations. Trade has been more functional than investments have. So when we look at from the mid to the longer term, this has very important consequences for the prospects of South-South economic relations. And it also points to me to a tension between the political drive that governments have tried to provide to the economic and to the business community, and the pragmatic stance of business decisions on investments. Right now in Brazil, this tension is clear. Even though government has supported actively the business community by providing credits to support the internationalizations of Brazilian enterprises, of Brazilian companies, their investment decisions have not followed the same political orientations that the government is trying to portray, and that's pointing clearly also to strengthening South-South relations to exploit opportunities in southern markets. So this disconnection is clearly in the Brazilian case, in my view. And finally, the text focuses on the link between South-South economic relations and global governance, and how emerging countries, and Brazil itself among them, have acted internationally to take advantage of this growing importance of South-South trade to devise new mechanisms of economic governance. And here, the G20, IBSA, and the BRIC maybe are the three major elements in these scenarios. I don't have time to develop how each of these initiatives has been approached by Brazil. But what is important is to take into account that they have different functionalities in devising global governance mechanisms. It's become kind of common sense to say that IBSA, regardless of its, regardless of the doubts of how effective it is, that IBSA is much about international cooperation, in spawning South-South cooperation, and not exactly economic relations. IBSA has been conceived as a political dialogue mechanism, and its most effective side has been on the international cooperation, on development assistance among the three countries, rather than a strict focus on economic issues. The BRICS, on the contrary, have much to do with international politics in trying to influence political decision-making on the major topics of the global agenda. So it's a promise in this sense, and the decision of the three countries to institutionalize the BRICS is really trying to upgrade BRICS, not only from a reference in world economics, but also an actor in international politics. So maybe in the next years we'll be watching the efforts to provide BRICS with the political field to become a more prominent actor within the multilateral stance and dealing much more with economic and political issues, something that IBSA is really limited in doing so. And the G20 is already fully incorporated, the financial G20, okay, has already incorporated emerging countries as part of the decision-making in terms of economic governance globally. Finally, as I'm running out of my time, I just want to point out some of the conclusions I have. Well, from the perspective of emerging economies, strengthening South-South relations at the political and economic levels has become more than attractive or opportune idea. It's been regarded as an imperative to foster changes in international order, to develop enduring governance mechanisms at the global level, and to pave the way for these countries to become effectively global actors, not only global traders, but global actors. Particularly to Brazil, this is a transition that's been taking place. Brazil has always defined itself as a global trader, but now is building its profile as a global actor, and South-South trade and economic relations is central to this endeavor. However, as coherent as this might sound for countries who are willing to address development changes while also changing their own international status, there are some tensions deriving from their participation and their promotion in South-South economic relations. The first has to do with the clash between its universalistic and pragmatic foreign trade policy orientation, on the one hand, and the political bias that is implied in the active defense and promotion of South-South trade as a core component of a strategy of inducing international transformations. Another visible tension has to do with the political orientation that governments are applying to South-South relations and South-South cooperation, and the more selective and pragmatic and autonomous approach of the business community, particularly referring to the investment decisions as have been mentioned. And finally, a quite evident difficulty to me lies in the reconciliation, in the case of Brazil, in its profile as an emerging power and the priority it has assigned to strengthening its political and economic ties with that core group of countries, India, China, and South Africa and Russia, on the one hand, and its commitment and engagement with the views of less developed countries in its own region and beyond that. So how to overcome the selective approach towards this core group of countries and the necessary consideration of the interest and the position of the less developed countries in their own regions and globally is something yet to be seen, to be responded to. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. My thanks actually to all three of you, not only for three very wonderful and pertinent presentations, but also for sticking to the time and hopefully setting a trend for later panels, that we leave enough time for our audience to also ask you. Before we do open up for questions, I did want to see if any of the three of you have any comments on what your colleagues said. I should also note that we hadn't planned this to be a Brazil panel. But I'm very happy it is, because we were worried that we have a China panel and that will overwhelm. So it's good to have this concentrated focus. All three of you have a case study on Brazil. I should also note, I did a quick count. We have 12 papers, and if you count the countries people are from, as well as the countries people live in, we have 12 countries represented in the 12 papers in terms of people. So hopefully in the discussion we can take it beyond just the cases and apply it to our other experiences. But any of you who might want to say anything about any of the, Catherine?
I've now had some time to sit here and think, so I'm, of course, got things to say. I do think that there's a really interesting thing that goes on with these southern cases, in that we are talking about a set of countries that have been, you know, the second-class citizens, if you will, of global politics. And now suddenly, with this move towards focusing on the South-South, they are much more in a position now of being rule makers. And so one of my questions really has to do with that. And for Mariana, I was intrigued by India's investment profile, and where so much of it seems to be non-financial services like IT and pharmaceuticals. And I'm wondering, now that India is exporting more of that, does that change, for example, how it's a global player on things like intellectual property issues? Because you would think that it would now have a different position on those issues because it's now exporting those. And I'm wondering how like do its preferences in international negotiations follow in some sense the material interest that it now has? I'd say it has a new material interest in intellectual property that it might not have had before. And then I have a question that's really for both of you, because both of you stressed the fact that many of these big southern countries are actually mostly investing in the north. And I guess there would be two ways of thinking about that, and I'm wondering if you have any sense of what drives that pattern, because on the one hand, it could be from the preferences of businesses, that businesses might think that they're more likely to make money in the north, and so they invest in the north. But the other, at least another part of it could be that, many of the southern countries actually have all sorts of restrictions on things like foreign investment, and you can't have as full ownership. And I'm wondering, how does that play, the differences between sort of the motivations of the businesses and then differences in the host countries?
Can I add to that before Mariana and listeners, because it's very much related to the second point. One of the things that struck me, and I would push you on this, is why is it a surprise that the percentage, the share invested is in the north is greater? I mean, that to me is exactly what you would expect. There are more investment opportunities in the north than there would be in the south. So there's nothing surprising. I would actually look not at the share, but at the absolute. If I'm a Pakistan or a Nigeria or any end of the country that's receiving this, it doesn't matter to me whether Brazil is doing more new investments in Europe. It does matter to me whether I see far more Brazilian investments around me. So in terms of this also relates to my other point, which listeners I've worked a lot on North-South, and I always thought that North-South discussions are much more about North than South. And similarly, now that we do South-South, I get a feeling that the South-South discussions might become much more about the first South than the second South. Meaning there's a South that is investing and sending trade, and there's a South that is receiving this investment. And if we look at the same questions from that end, it might also be different. But please.
Well, regarding the first question on whether the type of Indian investment has influenced or changed somehow the stance that India has towards intellectual property rights. Well, I haven't explored that much, but I think it's a very important point. And actually, there's some analysts like Sania Lal that hypothesize that as South multinationals moved into a more research and development intensive sectors, there might be also a move towards more protection towards a change in their stance towards intellectual protection rights. So yeah, but it would be definitely interesting to explore that. And regarding the second question, with which, well, is related to the way of approaching South-South investment. Yes, it's true that there's more opportunities in the north, and it's to answer your question is the reasons why or that drive business investment is mostly because they're looking, well, for markets, yes, but also to access technology that many of the companies in the north have had, and that they now see mergers and acquisitions as a way of having access to those research and development facilities and knowledge. And with regards to Adil's question, yes, I was thinking that it would be interesting to think, rather than in terms of my presentation, also in terms of the recipient countries, right? And this is related to Alcide's point of the focus towards less developed countries, and to analyze the influence that these countries are having in those, that Brazil, India, China, etc., are having in those less developed countries. Because when you look at the sources of origin for their investments, you may find, and you actually find, that the share that these BRIC have in those less development countries are very large. I mean, it's not that evident in this analysis, but if you look at the destinations, then you will notice that it has a very important weight. And it's not only for Brazil or India, but you can also notice that in terms of Mexican investment in Latin America, for example, you can see that in El Salvador, Nicaragua, or sometimes Colombia, Mexican investments have a large share, sometimes in the top 5 sources of investment.
And may also be qualitatively different. That goes
Yes.
to your question. You know, I mean, it may be less environment or more environment, but for a recipient country, they might say,
Yes.
well, it's less strings. It
Yes.
is more conducive to our way of doing things. Good or bad, that one can debate. But the quality of that investment for the recipient country or the structure may also be different.
Well, I agree that business community is absolutely pragmatic in decision making regarding the investments, and they will look for opportunities where they exist. They will look for technology, but there is an intriguing aspect to consider in this regard. Most of foreign direct investments promoted by Brazil, and that's not the case of China, but Brazil and India, are also concentrating in the service sector. And service sectors, we all know, tend to be the most dynamic sectors of GDP in each country, in mostly in the developed countries and also in our own economies. And this leads to a great concern. For example, in the case of Brazil, and these are the figures that have been announced a few weeks ago. In 2008, Brazilian foreign investments reached 35 billion in that year. 60% of it were oriented to services and were channeled to fiscal paradises like the Bermudas, the Cayman Islands, and Luxembourg. So there's a point here. There's a point here. That's what I meant when I said that there's a clear disconnection between the political drive that governments are trying to provide to the business community and the pragmatism of their decision. So if Bermudas, Cayman Islands, and Luxembourg are the recipients of the largest share of Brazilian capital abroad, what are the consequences for South economic relations? So that's the point.
Excellent point. Excellent point. Let us open up. I'm sure there's more here. May I suggest that if we have enough questions, we'll take a few and then come back. So if you can note the questions. We have a mic, please. We'll start with Nagesh and then up here. Please speak into the mic. It won't do anything to the sound, but then you will be recorded for all posterity.
Okay. Thank you. Thank you, Adil.
Yeah.
It's all right. It's the material. Now, I think
if you can introduce yourself, Nagesh, for others. If you can also say who you are for others.
I'm Nagesh Kumar from UN SCAP. SCAP is a regional commission of United Nations based in Bangkok. I was listening to this, discourse, very interesting and very enlightening. I just wanted to add a couple of points to the discussion on South-South foreign direct investment. We see a shift that it is becoming more concentrated in developed countries rather than developing countries. But it is because of measurement, the way it is measured, it doesn't fully reflect what is happening. When these new companies in the South develop their global ambitions, they tried first the greenfield route that set up one subsidiary in Nigeria, another in Mauritius, another in Sudan, another in, but that takes a long time to become a multinational or, a global player. Because you set up a greenfield investment from scratch, it takes 10 years to, develop and all that. They realize that a shortcut to becoming global is to buy global companies. And so they are not investing or acquiring any of the single country operations. All of the acquisitions are global companies. when Tatas buy Chorus, they get operations in 40 countries, not just England. And although it is shown in the papers as a deal involving Indian investment in UK, but it's not UK. Through UK, it is in 40 countries. Novelis of Canada, when it is acquired by another Indian company, it's again the same case. It's not an investment in Canada, but through Canada in 30 countries. So if you were to disaggregate them, you will get a completely different picture. The other point I wanted to make was to Catherine's presentation, which is about, you were talking about how the emerging countries may not be so much consistent with the environmental standards and all that. Well, in this environmental debate, we tend to often overlook the fact that for 30, 40 years, the polluting industries were shifted to the south. All the asbestos which you use anywhere in the Western world is not produced in north anymore. It is produced in the Chinas of the world and imported. And so when we look at the emissions and pollution, and one of the ways it has been achieved or is being achieved, is by shifting the polluting, dirty industries out of your way and import the products. So when we look at that, the developing countries have to comply with certain regulations. That factor should be taken into account. I just stop here. Thank you.
Yeah. Gentlemen up here in the front, while the mic comes up there's also sort of the Walmart effect. It may go to China, but eventually it will end up in my plate. So I'm ultimately the same consumer. Please introduce yourself.
Yes, thank you. I'm Ranza Rakutuman from Madagascar. I work in the National Investment Promotion Agency, so I'm really interested in the foreign direct investment. First of all, thank you all for your very interesting presentations. But I have two questions. Since when I will look at the economic relations, I was asking myself that how about the language barriers? Because that was the main cause of North-South relations, because they are the former traditional trading partners, but now the South-South, Brazilian, China, India, and Africa, they are speak different languages. So how about that in this development and the future of this South-South relationship? And also, from time to time, we've got some problem that arise in WTO, the World Trade Organizations. So how about South-South? Is there some strain on this relationship? Is there some, let's say, legal issues faced by international corporations from the South that is going into the trade or investment in those countries in the South? Or is just a case of China against the United States or China against Europe? Or is there Brazil against China or Brazil against India?
Internal differences.
And also, very high profiles cases that are given to the WTO to be resolved. Thank you.
So this goes back again to the multiple Souths. Anne at the back. Anne. Yep.
Hi, this is, can you hear me? I'm Anne Helwig. I'm in IR, International Relations, here at Boston University. These are really great talks. Thank you so much. I learned a lot from them. Here's a question. It kind of takes off from what Adil said. Among LDCs, there's a hierarchy. Clearly, there are more powerful LDCs than others. But within individual LDCs, there are also hierarchies. So if we look at the political discourse, South-South political discourse, it tends to be very progressive. It tends to be very much against oppression, etc. If we look within developing countries, a lot of countries talk the talk, but don't walk the talk. So we're seeing a lot of dynamism in terms of changing South-South relations. The question is this changing what's happening within Brazil? Is it fostering development? Is it changing within the LDCs the prospects for really walking the talk of the South? So. It's a question, just to kind of go one more step.
Yeah. Let's take one more comment from Kevin Gallagher here, and then we'll come back and maybe have another round later. Kevin?
Hi, I'm Kevin Gallagher here at Boston University. Hey, piggybacking on that last question, especially in the last two presentations, there lurking behind it is some idea that South-South economic relations might be more development friendly than North-South economic relations, and I just want to pull out and ask the panelists directly about whether or not they think South-South trade or South-South foreign investment will be more development friendly. You know, when it comes to foreign investment, the econometric evidence basically shows that there's been a lack of what are called spillovers on the microeconomic level. There's a famous article that summarizes the econometric evidence called "Much Ado About Nothing" by Gorgon Greenway in the World Bank Economic Review that shows that all the foreign investment that went to the developing world in the last 20 years has not had that much of a developmental impact. It hasn't had these positive spillovers, not the balance of payments things, but the microeconomics. So what is it about South-South foreign investment in particular that might make it more developing friendly? You know, why would a private firm from India treat its fellow developing country host any differently than a private firm from the United States?
Thank you. Excellent question. Let me open up to all three. Especially, I would just only add to that. I think sort of this is a central thing that's also been worrying, not worrying, but we've been grappling with Rachel and myself. We don't take a normative position. There are UN agencies that sometimes do that. South-South must be good, but we want to get a sense, you know, what is good or bad about it, and what could be done within it that would make it more better and otherwise. So, any and all on any or all of the questions.
Should I start?
Please.
Thank you for your comment there at the beginning. And I would say that your point about the 30 to 40 years that polluting industries have moved to the south is, in fact, exactly Grossman and Kruger's point about the composition effect of trade. So this is an effect or a final point that has a trade origin and in fact makes that argument very well. I would just say, as kind of as a second point, it's not clear to me that that is going to happen in South-South trade. I have a feeling that those industries are going to stay in the countries of the South in which they now are, if only because right now the sort of the second South, if we call them that, probably isn't in an economic situation to take those on. But I think there's a more fundamental question that you're raising that to me is a very interesting one, and Adil followed up on it too. You know, almost all of the discussion about sort of the impact of environment and from the economy and things like that tends to be focused on the production side. And the whole climate change regime, for example, and the question about holding countries to account for their climate emissions is almost entirely calculated on the basis of their production. Now, if you said, okay, so China now has these enormous contributions to climate emissions, but mostly to produce things that they send to the United States. You know, if you ask the climate change question from the consumption side as opposed to from the production side, you get very, very different arguments about it. And in fact, the last talk that I gave was in Norway, and it was a conference on South African climate change.
In Norway.
In Norway. You can ask me personally, like, why we were doing that there and why I was there. But I think it was very interesting because for that, I actually did a bunch of looking to find all these different graphs of climate change and measures of it and all this kind of thing. But the only place where I could find a consumption-based analysis of climate change was in one particular book by my friend Timmons Roberts on climate justice. And his point is basically to make the point that most of our international discussion about sort of environmental impacts of production focuses only on the production side and does not focus on the consumption side. So I think that's a very interesting point that comes out here. And I'll just sort of move from that into this question that's come up in a number of different ways, sort of a whole question about progressiveness. And I think it is a kind of, even if you guys don't have this this idea behind this conference, I mean, I think there has been a kind of historic assumption that South-South trade is a progressive project. And certainly I know in the Brazilian case it's talked about like that, and there's a presumption that it will be better. And I would just spotlight for you that I think my presentation here is one of the places where we're actually starting to ask some questions kind of seriously, because we presume that South-South, or we have presumed that there's a progressiveness to South-South. But when we start to look at some of the issues beyond simply economic development that might be important to us, like human rights protections or environmental protections. It's not at all clear, in fact, that South-South trade brings positive effects. And I won't make a final conclusion about that right now, but I think it's an interesting, important set of questions to be asking. Just exactly what are the consequences of South-South trade? And
sorry to again, but for a very southern sort of activist mindset, which is where I spend most of my time, one of the arguments to your presentation could be, aha, here comes the new protectionism. We see China rising, so let's raise the environmental boogie again.
Well, but the point of my talk is that has been, in fact, very much the dialogue of this set of countries about environmental protectionism. And I think it's one of the reasons why their trade is actually not likely to have some of the technique effects, because I think it's very unlikely that countries that have been pushing, and that's still in a North-South context, push arguments about environmental protectionism. I think the odds that they're going to turn around and insist on environmental protection with other countries of the South with which they're trading is very, very low. And it's one of the reasons why I think there's not going to be much of a technique effect or a positive technique effect from South-South trade.
Mariana?
Yes, well, regarding I think the measurement and the development question are somehow related, because this presentation addresses the foreign direct investment South-South level in a very general manner. And that's part of the reason that I wanted also to explore more like industry-specific relations, because I think that the more you get into the details, then you are able to have interesting findings and move beyond these generalizations. In terms of the measures, yes, if you disaggregate the data, then you can find a different picture. And that's why, for example, in the pharmaceutical, we could see that the shares of the South increased comparatively. And also in terms of the IT. And these are, I would say, perhaps the most knowledge-intensive industry. So we would probably see that the lower we get in terms of technology intensiveness, then we would see a larger amount of South-South cooperation, particularly, for example, in terms of manufacturing products and that are aiming at reaching markets in the South countries. Regarding the assumption that we are following or that might be followed with regards to South-South foreign direct investment and whether they are more development friendly or not, I would say, well, this is a very preliminary study, but if we might expect or we might see a very mixed picture, because the truth is that while there's been some studies that do find some increased training, for example, in the Indian case, there's some companies that are displaying more sensitivity with regards to employees and the community development programs or training local employees. Well, it is a very interesting subject, and I think that it deserves much more attention. From my own experience at Monterrey, I can see that Indian companies do train their employees in but this is perhaps related to the fact that they are IT companies. It would be very interesting to look at, for example, natural resources and how the standards they are following, and this relates directly to what Catherine was mentioning regarding the standards and emissions and all the natural or environmental effects. So it is definitely, we have to look to have a closer look at those issues. And only just to address your concern about how language barriers might be important in South-South cooperation, I think that, well, at least in the Indian and Brazilian case, they have been able, companies from these countries have been able to overcome these barriers largely because they are very diverse countries, large, and they have multicultural backgrounds. I think that with English in general, we could expect that not to become a very significant barrier, because English is used in most of the mergers and acquisitions. I go again to the Mexican case, where when Cemex invests in Egypt, they use English, and so that's not a big obstacle it's rather other constraints, risk, etc.
Thank you. Lisa?
Let me start just adding to this point. I think that cultural aspects are really important in this regard. Language, I agree with her, is not really the obstacle that companies, third world companies, face when they start, when they go global, when they go internationally. But dealing with culture aspects in the markets, in the countries, and the regions in which they are operating, this is a kind of learning processes. And in the case of Brazil, it's been really interesting to realize how important this has become, because we were kindly recipients of foreign direct investments, of foreign companies operating in Brazil, and we dealt with these cultural differences from the perspective of a recipient country. And now you have to go to do the other way around. So with India, with Latin America, with our own Latin American neighbors, this has been really a central issue in this learning process, how to recognize and deal with the cultural and national specificities of each country and each market. On the comment that when companies go global, they also are buying global companies, and at the longer term, this gives them an outreach that goes far beyond the national markets in which they are first arriving. Yes, but I think it would be interesting also to disaggregate this within different sectors, because there are manufacturers and services activities that provide opportunity to expand the reach of for investments, but other decisions are made looking at opportunities and conditions that are mostly regionally based, not strictly local, but regionally based and regionally defined. That somehow constrains also the reach that these investments might have. So I think this deserves much more empirical research to see how much of these southern investments in different activities are really generating opportunities at a global scale from the mid to the long term. And the question of how friendly South-South economic relations are and South-South trade are for development is an interesting one. I would say that in principle, we should not make any significant distinction between North and South trade in this regard, in this particular regard. I think what changes is the political framework that is attached to that. And the political framework attached to South-South trade relations is clearly pointing at the possibility of it providing chances to level asymmetries, to correct asymmetries, to balance asymmetries that are embedded in North-South relations. So I think that's much more the political framework that is attached to it that makes the difference between a North-South or a South-South divide.
Thank you very much. I must confess, I have been a bad manager of time. We are 10 minutes behind, but I have learned a tremendous lot. And I've actually had fun in this discussion, so I think time is okay then. Yeah, we are 10 minutes behind. What I would request is, first of all, please thank all of our three participants for a really wonderful start. I know we have other questions. We'll keep coming back to them, and I hope especially this question of, what is good about South-South, if anything, is one that will remain in this room throughout the day. I think you've set us off on a very, very good track, and many of these things will keep coming back.